Afternoon and welcome. We hope that you are enjoying all of the great work that NDGain is presenting to us, especially the work that Joyce, Jessica, Natesh, Martin, Chen, and all of the Notre Dame team has done in the recent past. We have a panel that promises to be very interesting. I like to engage the audience in as much as possible. Some of the people sitting up here are people that we know for quite some time and or their organizations and have been, in the case of, for example, Gary Lawrence, from the very beginning, a big supporter of some of the ideas behind this endeavor. The panel title is Business Continuity, Preparing to Avoid Disaster, which happens very often, that we have in many countries situations that cause lives and damage to livelihoods. The idea is that we're going to use 45 minutes to go about a few questions that I will be asking the panel after a short 3-minute introduction that each of them will provide. And then we'll have some time for Q&A, which is one of the areas we look forward to hearing the most about. You have in the information provided to you the background of each of the members of the panel, but I like to highlight the fact that in the case of Steve from IDB, the IDB has been doing a lot of work in Latin America, including at the city level, where indicators have been developed. And IDB, as the World Bank, uses as an input matrix like the NDGain index to make some of the decisions that will impact communities. We also know that the World Food Program, for example, uses it. There is a lot of evidence. And so he can tell us how, as IDB advises governments, countries, and from the private sector arm of the AIDB, how they also deal with issues related to business continuity. Emily Massacurati, Italian? She's the vice president and she's the founder and CEO of 427. Gary Lawrence, VP and Chief Sustainable Officer of AECOM. As I mentioned, Gary has been very close to us. He has had hands-on experience in many developing countries and, of course, here in the United States, lived in Brazil for several years and was part of the staff that advised President Lula on the improvement of conditions in many cities. You've been to Brazil, you know that traffic and others aspects of cities are of great relevance, has done something similar in big cities, large cities in California. Nancy Gillis, Senior Manager, Sustainable Supply Chain, Procurement and Supplier Management from Ernst & Young, from EY. Also an organization, a company that with which we have had a long relationship. We know many of the colleagues that Nancy has there. And we also know that they are very interested about the possibility or how best to actually use the index not only as a training tool internally, but also as they establish relationships with their clients. And so we very much look forward to hearing from you. And what I will ask you is that you take 3 minutes or so to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what your organization, your companies are doing on this topic, and then I have a few questions to go about. So maybe start with Steve.
Thank you very much, Dr. DeBoob. My name is Steve Wilson. I am with the Multilateral Investment Fund of the Inter-American Development Bank, which is in the private sector side of our institution. We do, in fact, the bank has availed itself of the NDGain methodology on several instances, find it particularly useful. On the public sector side, clearly colleagues there have used it. So we really salute the efforts that are being done in your organization, very pioneering. The Multilateral Investment Fund has been in existence for about 20 years. We are the largest technical assistance provider in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we also do a significant amount of work in private equity and venture capital funding. I'm the designer and helping to manage a program along with a colleague, Carlos Sanchez, here in the audience, called ProAdapt, which is a $12 million facility that's co-funded by the Nordic Development Fund to address the issue of climate resilience and climate risks facing smaller companies and value chains in our region. We're also doing some market assessments. Since our donors don't like the word studies, we call them market assessments on this issue, and I can talk about that perhaps a little bit later in response to any questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Emily?
Good afternoon. My name is Emily Mazzacarati. I am indeed the founder and CEO of 427. We are a company dedicated to climate risk analysis and climate adaptation consulting. The reason I came to be here, you'll soon find out that this panel is exclusively composed of Andy Gaines' biggest fans. But what we do is we work with corporations that may look at data sets and tools that are available, like Andy Gain, and say, this is great data, but look, I have 900 facilities and 12,000 providers. How do I even start using this, right? So we come in as a sort of an intermediary. We help companies understand and map where their supply chain commodities come from, what commodities they depend on, which countries those may come from. And again, if you think about just a single component like this mic could be made of thousands and thousands of different pieces. If you piece it down, it could come from thousands of places around the world, the different pieces, the different suppliers. So we help companies map that, understand where things come from, what they depend on, and then we overlay Andy Gain data and other data sets relevant to climate change so that companies can understand and start seeing hotspots in their supply chain and in their operations. And they're able to see, oh, we're dependent on this type of metals, which is largely sourced from this group of countries, and look, they don't rank very well on the index, especially in terms of infrastructure. And that is the beginning of the conversation in many ways, to have that risk assessment, for companies to start thinking about what it is that they can do to reduce their risk exposure and to start talking about potentially investing in resilience in their supply chain, and hopefully in a way that doesn't just benefit their own supply chain and their own corporate interests, but also in a way that benefits the communities where they operate. So we break down the risk between the exposure, the where things are happening, the sensitivity, what companies are doing, what type of materials do they depend on, and adaptive capacity. Who are the players, how prepared are they, and how can they prepare even better and start dealing better with the risk.
That sounds so familiar. Gary, please.
Good afternoon, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm here because I want to bring initially the concept of resilience down to the micro scale, and that's my household. My wife really loves Juan Jose, and so I can refuse him nothing if I want to get along at home. So that's the primary reason I'm here. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for AECOM. AECOM is now a company of about 110,000 people. We're a design, build, finance, and operate company. We do vertical issues, buildings all over the world. We also do horizontal water, energy, ports, anything having to do with the human environment, the physical aspects of the human environment, our company is involved with in some way, shape, or form. As a result, it really matters to us whether or not decision makers, public and private, actually have the information that allows them to make good choices about where to spend scarce resources. Because we have to make a profit for our shareholders, but we also have to keep our workforce engaged positively in the things that matter to them, and that is improving society as we're also in pursuit of improving our company and those sorts of things. What I really like about the index is that it remains pragmatic. It actually produces information that allows people to make difficult choices and communicate why those choices have to be made. The issues that were discussed in the earlier panel, and I thought that panel was fantastic, by the way. We have something to live up to. That in terms of the vulnerability and readiness, for us, the vulnerability matters hugely, but for most of the instances in which we're working, the index is at a scale that doesn't allow us to have a direct conversation with the particular decision makers about their vulnerability. The smaller the country, the more accurate it becomes. But the readiness part of it is the basis for every conversation we have, not necessarily this index, but the idea of readiness is the basis for every conversation we have within the company about where we should try to grow the company. And it's also essential to our conversations with our clients about where they should be trying to grow their companies as well. So, as was said earlier, we're all fans. Last thing I'll say is that I've been in this since Juan Jose and I met at a meeting at the Rockefeller Foundation when I was rambling on about disaster resilience. This is a work in progress. It was very good when it was gain. It's getting ever better as it's indie gain. And it's one of those rare occurrences where as something is put in the academic environment, it retains its pragmatism. And I think that's a credit to Notre Dame.
Thank you very much, Gary. Nancy?
It's always great to go last after these introductions, because what am I going to say that's going to be anything different about what we do? But and why we're up here. But I do have something to differentiate myself from my colleagues who are up here, which is that I actually represent an organization that, for majority of our client base, we don't talk about sustainability. We don't talk about resilience. We don't talk about adaptive. We talk about we're a successful Fortune 100 firm. We seek to remain a successful Fortune 100 firm. The world has changed. Help me understand how it's changed. What do I need to do different? And they come to Ernst & Young because if you're going to tell us to do something different, if we're Fortune 100 and you're talking in the realm of supply chain, what we're talking about here today is business continuity, predominantly in supply chains, then, my supply chains are pretty massive, right? They span the globe. They're very impactful. So if you're going to tell me to change it, then you better be telling me based on information that is pragmatic and credible. And our brand, EY, really is based on the fact of credibility. So I'm always pleased to be able to use the great work that somebody has made publicly available for free, thank you, to support the needs of our clients, because actually that's what IndieGain does, is it backs up the credibility need. And it backs it up in, you've got organizations who, they're not foolish. Companies understand these are CEOs, these are middle managers who read the paper just like we do. And they say the world has changed. And so how do I now, as I go into emerging markets, as I attempt to replicate my supply chain in those markets, as I have to make long-term sourcing decisions, as I have to do all of these things that some of the other panelists have already mentioned, if I have to do them differently, what does that mean? And know that I can't move on a dime. I don't have, infinite amounts of cash to do this. So make sure that you're giving me practical information that I can trust, that really goes to a level of detail. And the area that we're really seeing it for companies right now, interestingly enough, is, and I think it was referenced, this idea of, you're running out of countries to go to if you're in pursuit of low labor, right? Low-cost labor. And now when you go into those particular countries, there's also an awakening by those countries that, if you're going to come in, we appreciate economic development. We appreciate company investment. But we also appreciate that we need to build our infrastructure. We also, as countries, understand the need to be resilient and adaptive. And so right now what we're seeing as EY, and a lot of the area that I work in, is if you're talking about supply chains, if you're talking about engaging those supply chains and changing your supplier base, you're talking to countries and you're talking about how you invest in those countries differently. Social license to operate. Actually using what used to be just philanthropy dollars. You know, look good, I'm a good social citizen, I built a school. Look at the picture. Yeah. Not anymore. Because it's understood that's part of the change. And where do you go to understand if you're going to move into another country and you want to make those investments that's beyond just the pretty picture? What should you be investing in? That's what IndyGain gives you. So we're also a huge fan, and we really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And I know the practice that you have created at EY is not only well respected because of the people that listen and you and your colleagues, but also because you are really reaching into those areas that have otherwise been delayed or ignored for a period of time, and you are leading in that effort. I like to start with one very basic question, which to an extent Emily put on the table when she described, and I'm an industrial engineer, so when she was describing how to put together the microphone, I was thinking of all the models that I used to see before. Give us a sense of how is climate change impacting business continuity? A sense both in terms of orders of magnitude, if you have a dimension to share with us, but also in terms of you know, the something that has no price, which is lives of people. So give us a sense of that, and then I would like to build on that with Steve, because I'm sure the bank has also some facts and figure about this, but I want you to build on it with how important it is to have these public-private partnerships where you need the government to create the conditions, kind of to prepare the terrain, the readiness part of the equation to attract investment that you will finance. And so the role of public-private partnerships, especially in Latin America, but beyond that. And then we'll have other topics for Gary and Nancy. So let's start with you, Emily, please.
Sure. Well, so when you start talking about business continuity and climate change, I think everybody's mind goes to hurricane, storm, a big extreme weather event that suddenly shuts down everything. And that's obviously one of the forms that it can take. But the first point I want to make is that it can take many other forms and many other impacts that people don't necessarily think of at first glance. Extreme weather events can span a number of different types of weather, including drought and floods and extreme rain. So all of these need to be taken into account, but also some of the gradual changes that are brought about by climate change that may at some point culminate into a point where it brings business disruptions. And this could be through some health impacts, it could be geopolitical impacts, it could be impacts on ecosystem, on the labor force, it could be through a lot of indirect pathways that may have been caused directly or indirectly by climate change. And a great example of that is the floods that took place in Thailand in 2011. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this example and real life situation back in 2011, where a large part of Thailand's central plain was flooded. Turns out a lot of electronic manufacturers were co-located in that place, and essentially the tech industry in the US shut down for a while because they ran out of key critical components. Now, the drivers of the floods in Thailand were, for one part, climate change and a more frequent high level of precipitation in that specific location. But it was also some of those longer trends: urbanization, the growth in population, urbanization in a way that wasn't with lack of permeable pavements, and a lot of things that led to the same amount of rain as 30 years before, culminating into giant floods, whereas that hadn't been the case. So when you look at those, at the likelihood and what can drive these events that disrupt businesses, you have to look both at the individual events and the long-term trends that can run into that can intersect and create those tipping points. And then the other point that I want to make quickly is I had another point. It was going to be a great point. Maybe I'll just stop there for now.
We'll come back to that. Steve?
Well, certainly in terms of public-private partnerships, we're keenly interested in this and how the role of changing climates impacts that kind of development. Take, for example, infrastructure. Right now, it appears that there's really no accepted methodology globally for a sovereign to approach private partners and essentially apportion climate risks within that deal. This is kind of a cutting-edge area. Or likewise, credit ratings, sovereign credit risk. How will climate risks affect that? And clearly, policy is highly variable and is in some countries, frankly, lagging the change in climate. And it's certainly not in the countries we work. I mean, we see this around the world. We also have the opportunity at the Multilateral Investment Fund to work with very small partners for whom business continuity is synonymous with livelihood continuity, and failing in that response is exiting the market. And it wasn't that long ago, even in the interior of northeastern Brazil, 30 or so years ago, where smallholder farmers were dying as a result of famine in the early 80s, as a result of drought, having guessed wrong. So we work a lot in agriculture, and it's not just 20 degrees on either side of the equator. Anywhere you go on the globe, and you deal with people who are involved in growing or transporting or processing agricultural products, irrespective of their beliefs about anthropogenic climate change, they'll all tell you the patterns are different, and they don't know why. But it's that uncertainty that drives, it either drives stasis or it drives sometimes a non-strategic attempt to do something in the face of that uncertainty. So we're, for a certain set of our clients, business continuity is really adaptation or building resilience. If you're in a low-level, if you're in a valley in Nicaragua, it very well may be the case within a generation or so you're not going to be viable producing coffee. You're going to have to either diversify into cocoa or move up the mountain if that's an option. So, climates are changing. Policy has lagged. We do operate, at least in ProAdapt, on a very simple hypothesis, and that is that there's a lot more going on within the market that addresses climate resilience than is currently being counted for or framed in such a way. And we think, in fact, we're going to be doing a 3-country study with the Nordic Development Fund in 3 major developing countries, one in Latin America, one in Asia, and one in Africa, to look precisely with a transverse team of trying to get an informed estimate of what are some of the products and services that are being demanded and supplied in, say, 2 strategic sectors, one of which would probably be agriculture. What are financial institutions doing? How are they framing or assessing climate risk in their portfolios, their business models? How is policy and civil society trying to catch up with this? But we do think that with a climate risk methodology that incorporates variability and not just the 100-year event meteorological cycle, while it's ultimately about uncertainty, you're hoping that at least you can get the navigational beacons right so that you know what your bounded parameters are for action going forward. So there's a lot of interest in that work. And again, PPPs, whether they're concessions or whether they're less formal kinds of arrangements, offer an enormous amount of hope, because without the policy world, we wouldn't even be sitting here. But it's private actors who are coming up with solutions daily across the planet, and those solutions are local. The financing may come from somewhere else, some of the design, but this to date is not really being captured by anybody's statistics. And we'd like to at least have a first modest shot across the bow, shine some light on it, and bring, hopefully, you folks and other people into that space, because private initiative is actually acting very proactively, but perhaps not strategically.
As you engage with countries, say in a specific example, to do a public-private partnership to build a new road in Nicaragua, to take the country that you mentioned. And the recommendation is that the road be built with certain characteristics in order to prevent that flooding that could happen in that period
Or
of time.
heat stress on bridges, yeah.
That's right. And that will require perhaps a 20% higher investment
Absolutely.
amount of money in terms of what is needed. What is there any resistance, and if there is, how are you managing that, both from the financing perspective, and do you find that countries or the leaders that are making these decisions actually say, yes, I want to build it better, because I do believe that what I have seen in the past is going to be more frequent or much more damaging next time that it happens?
Well, that's a strategic question, and it's interesting. I didn't know you had an engineering background. I know your financial background, so that makes you very formidable. As you well know, the two tribes of finance and engineering do not always frame this question in the same way. And we had a conference in Barbados on coastal infrastructure in which we brought some of the leading engineers out there. Interestingly, Canada leads in the area of climate resilient infrastructure. They have a new protocol and so forth, and some very cutting edge financial people. Finance, there is not that universally accepted sort of net present value approach to how to build resilience into infrastructure. Engineers, to use the word pragmatic, tend to say, let's just bake in another 20%. And as an engineer, and based on my professional judgment, I'll sign off on that. Based on scenarios or a set of scenarios or an average of climate scenarios, they'll bake it in, and then they're happy with that. As you know, as an economist, marginal cost equals marginal benefit. Baking in another 20% leaves you somehow unsatisfied. Where's the optimum? But there is not on the financial side I think there's a lot of methodological work that could be done there. I would hope that some of the world's leading universities have bright young people who have still a few brain cells who are plugging away on this. But we do not, at least in my observation, there is not a common financial way of assessing and costing and apportioning risks.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's you have
No,
a
no.
deeper...
I think I was a minister of finance in my country, and when they would come with proposals to build a new road and cost $1 million per kilometer to make that $1.2 million for XY reasons, I would want to know what would be the return on my investment, and quantifying that to an extent. I think Endigain is trying to do that when you see that in the last, I think we have, 17 years, now 16 years, 18 years of data that shows what has happened and what measures you have taken or not taken that help you save lives and livelihoods. So if you can incorporate that in the analysis and say, yes, it's going to cost you $1.2 million, but next time the rain happens, you're going to save 2,000 lives. And so I think there is a way, but the multilateral agencies, IDB, the World Bank, and others, have to also not only put that on the table, but be creative with the instruments like the catastrophe fund that was developed for the Caribbean islands and for the Pacific island. Anyway, I want Gary to also help us with this. There are, depending on which numbers you want to take, some between 50 and up to $100 billion a year that are estimated to be needed just in developing countries for the next 25 years, just for these countries to achieve a level of resilience or adaptive capacity that puts it at the level of the, let's say, top 10 that Jessica was talking about early this morning. That money is not going to come from the IDB or the World Bank or the UN, nor it will come from taxation. I can guarantee you that. So it has to come from investments done from the private sector. For the private sector to invest, there needs to be the conditions that makes an investor actually built horizontally or vertically, the many infrastructure that is needed in each country, and have a long-term horizon, 15, 20 years, that A, their business is not going to be nationalized, B, that you can repatriate capital, C, that the rules of the game will tend to stay more or less very stable, so that I can index and appropriately account for risks. So, Gary, as you and AECOM get involved into these multi-billion dollar projects, multi-year, with 110,000 people working around the world, how are you making the pitch to your clients, whether it is countries, cities, or private companies that want you to build a power plant for them? How are they considering the business continuity part of the equation? And B, do they have the resources? Are they able to raise the resources to make these investments? And how does that change from a developed country to a developing country? I know it's a very long three-part question, but you are so smart that you will know how to respond to it.
I love unanswerable questions. What's the pitch? Well, let's go back to the 20% baked in. When we talk to our clients about disaster resilience and investment, two things we talk about. One is this investment actually going to increase the likelihood that economic activity will increase and the poor will be able to afford the cost associated with this? For us, the increasing the economic activity in the nation or the region or the city is one of the key investment activities associated with this. And we also try to reframe the questions. With regard to climate, we are talking more and more on business continuity questions about the water, food, energy, security nexus, as opposed to just climate. There's so many people for whom climate is so abstract that they can't mount the conversation that allows them to choose to act. When you get to these other issues, for instance, that nexus I mentioned, for the private sector, one of the things that's key is that they have clean, reliable source of water. They have a clean, reliable source of energy. That they have sufficient agricultural, so the nutrition works. All of that is a precondition to the maintenance of a civil society. And we can't invest or work where there's not rule of law and where there's incivility. So when we talk about pricing and whether or not we're going to go into that market and create an office, I mean, the reason we're a design, build, finance, and operate company is that we have our own investments that we put into projects in order to help win work and those sorts of things, part of our pitch. We have to do it in a way so that all of these risks associated with supply chain issues are actually incorporated into the conversation about whether the society will be stable or not. Yeah, we can actually design ports, which we do, that can anticipate sea level rise, even though the probabilities associated with getting it right are getting it wrong are 100%, because the future is random and chaotic. You really can't anticipate 40 years out what the circumstances are going to be. And many of the investments we're involved with are 100-year investments as opposed to 10-year or 5-year investments. So, and that's on the infrastructure side of the equation. So we try to reframe the question so that we can leverage opportunities across systems rather than focus on only a single system. And that way we can engage more actors in the society in seeing that this is something where pulling together public and private money actually makes sense. I guess the last thing I would say is that with regard to the idea of business continuity, that there are all sorts of issues that you can talk about within the context of continuity. One of them, thinking about the conversations this morning about New Orleans and Katrina, I was told by Swiss Re that the biggest insurance costs were associated with the business continuity of the convention business. New Orleans, it was only one of only 10 cities in the U.S. that could host a convention of 15,000 people or more. It took it off the market for 10 years, which was how far people forecast where they're going to hold their conventions, all that sort of stuff. And people have to get paid. They have to get paid for not being able to go there, and they have to get paid a premium for finding a new place. So there are all sorts of things that take place in society where this idea of continuity and adaptation and business risk have to be incorporated. And it's a broader definition of supply chain rather than materials and that sort of stuff. But there's all sorts of things that have to be supplied that are at risk.
Thank you, Gary. Nancy, one of the things that when I was at the World Bank, there was a movement at the global level to try to enhance or slightly change the way you prepare your financial statements so that you can incorporate and reflect some of the soft costs or soft investments, or at least described that way, that are not necessarily part of your bottom line, yet you are somehow being measured by that. With especially in developed countries where every month, every quarter, you have to meet certain minimum results. But also in developing countries, we start to see that more and more what you do matters not only in terms of the business continuity, as we have been talking about it, of an earthquake or a storm or a poorly designed facility to break down and interrupt your business where you lose your clients and why not, but also how to properly reflect this information in a way that adds value to your company rather than impacts it. So from EY's perspective, when you talk to your clients, when you advise them, when you help them review their systems, is this something that is more and more becoming a part of the conversation, if it is how you are addressing it? And I would also be very interested if you can, just like Gary just did with the example of Katrina in the convention center, if you can give us an example or an idea of how that is in reality being implemented by companies.
So, yeah, I mean, I think as I had kind of said in my opening comments as well, you start seeing companies have a different understanding. We're calling it the valuation of intangibles. Mm-hmm. So it's moving beyond the financial aspect of the bottom line, going to something that I think all of us know, the triple bottom line perspective, or the inclusion of environmental and social as part of valuation processes. But as Steve said, you know, we're Ernst & Young started and still has a very strong part of our business on the audit side and taxes, and along with having lots of colleagues who have minimal senses of humor because they're very focused. We have as well those who understand the emphasis of credibility in that space is you have a process that is agreed upon, and we don't quite have that. We have more of a space for that for the environmental, but for the social, how do you actually quantify positive social impacts? How do you monetize that? How do you integrate that into one single financial report, even if you just use it internally? So yes, there is movement towards that because companies are understanding supply chains are not just I go in and I search out, you know, the best priced workforce for myself. I'm also looking at that juncture, I'm going to particular economies because that's where my customers are. So I'm now making investments where I'm having to quantify in a broader way that it's not just I'm trying to quantify the risks associated with business continuity with either the shorter term, the impact of weather events, which companies are starting to learn are not all black swan, right? They're not thinking, oh, I'm held captive by the fact that maybe if another volcano will explode. There's an understanding that, yes, it's not linear any longer. That's the whole point, right? I went to school for system modeling, so it's great when you start thinking in systems perspective. It's not all linear. And they're awakening to that themselves. They're better able to do some of the costing of what those environmental risks are. But as far as Emily said as well, it's kind of peeling back the onion. The environmental may add to situations in which the populace doesn't have access to some of the core issues that they need. Clean water leads to health concerns, food stuff, so forth. So you start having a customer base that's potentially not there. You don't have a workforce that's there. You have investments that you've made that geopolitically have been destabilized. So, yeah, are companies saying, how do I value those risks? How do I know what's interrelated? How do I tease those out? How do I make CapEx decisions, pulling that into the costing structure? But is it defined and confident and something in which it's not going to need still a lot of work? No. But have no fear. The Ernst & Young is here to help you down that road.
You care to share an example? And you have a fantastic publication where you have case studies that are very illustrative. But for the benefit of the audience, and also because we have some students from Notre Dame Streamline watching us, maybe you care to share about one of those case studies that where you can show how the intervention or the advice of EY and a company actually change the risk profile by incorporating some of the ways of creating more resilience or adaptability capacity within their business.
So one of the things is we did help a food company to the point of obviously they're being impacted immediately by climate impacts, not only just from weather, but also climate impacts in the larger of from rural to urbanization, population shifts and so forth. We had a food company who actually was thinking through, and who here in the audience, I don't want to call you out, but chocolate fans? That's why I love
I think
the
it's
word on
always
this one.
here. Well,
So let's just say that they had as part of their product portfolio some chocolate products, right? And their concerns were that, I hope I'm not breaking it to any of you guys, but cocoa is one of the hugely threatened commodities. It's had, a major price increase since 2011. There's a concern that by 2020 there's going to be a million-ton shortfall of cocoa. So, stockpile chocolate. But as an example, realistically, the concern here is, and this actually highlights the challenges associated with what seems to be a simple question. Usually you would have an organization go through, and it's a sourcing problem, right? Let's go to an alternative place. There's got to be someplace else that I can grow this thing, right? But I need it, obviously, if I'm a major user of this particular agricultural input, I need a lot of it at a certain quality level, guaranteed certain price. And so contrary to what normally they would have done is just looked for alternative sourcing strategies, when the world tells you there's no other place that you can go get it, you got to invest. And what do you invest? And so we have seen this particular client was very confused as to what type of actual investments do I make. And one would think it's just the investments in helping increase the sustainable agricultural practices so that you have more productive output. But if you really look at the cocoa problem, you understand it's not just the fact that you don't have the output that's necessary. It's not just all environmental. It's also just as much social. Not surprisingly, you've got a group of upcoming soon-to-be cocoa farmers who are saying, you know what, this is really hard work. I can actually grow something else, or I can move to a city, not as much backbreaking labor, better job, why not? So you have these other actual impacts happening, and it was helping that client figure out, if you're going to go into that particular area, and it's a business continuity requirement for you, for your product portfolio, you know, how do you best invest? How much do you take into putting it into sustainable agricultural? How much do you take it into actually helping educate young people to make them see that there's opportunities to stay? So you have a continuity of labor force that actually wants to work there. How do you improve? What do you invest as far as the family unit themselves? And it's that type of work that we did, and they have seen a measurable positive impact in this particular area where they're sourcing from, in which they find this really new for them, because all of a sudden it's not just a sourcing problem, it is a business continuity that had a very strong social answer. So I think that's the new piece of how companies can really be impactful on infrastructure decisions and decisions that really can, at large scale, have geopolitical impacts and really move countries forward, is because they're seeing that it goes to the heart of their own operations and their ability to survive.
Well, before I open the floor for a few questions, you will just put a question forward for any of you who would like to address it. But it has to do with actually using the best tools or the right tools to measure what you want to measure, because there are in terms of country risk or sector risk, there are several matrix out there, including what rating agencies do, for example. But thinking about your own business, and of course Emily's work is especially about that. So I guess it's more for the other three in terms of when you present to your clients proposals, do you see that a tool like ND Gain or comparable to that will help you make the case? And what other bells and whistles would you like to see in a tool like ND Gain that would perhaps enhance that conversation with your client or with your organization? So it's open to anybody. You are very familiar with the index, Gary.
I don't know if I've said it today, but in our work, we find that there are 3 truths that we need to apply to every project we're working on. It has to be technically feasible, economically viable, and politically acceptable. So you can have the first 2, and actually those are easier than the political acceptability. And so the tools we need, that the ND Gain tool does, and some other ones, we're looking for tools that increase the likelihood that the person who has to make a decision will make a decision that adds value for them and for us. And it's not a profound thing to say, but that's what we're looking for. And in many instances, it doesn't matter how technically brilliant the tool is. It can be technically amazing if it's not producing information that's intuitively obvious for people who aren't technicians, because for the most part, they're the ones who are making decision about where to invest and how much.